The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with a soft orange glow as the city entered its late afternoon routine. Frank Carter and Mike Benson were patrolling in their squad car, slowly driving through the streets of Ashtonville, a mid-sized city with its share of daily problems. The trees lining the sidewalks swayed in the breeze, and the distant sound of hurried cars downtown provided the usual soundtrack of urban life. Frank and Mike had been partners for almost 12 years, old friends who had been through various situations together. Both were in their mid-40s, but time in the police department had treated each of them differently. Frank was robust, with a constant serious expression and eyes that never seemed to rest. He believed every day was a battle and that a good cop had to always be alert, always suspicious. Mike, thinner and more relaxed, had a lightness that Frank sometimes envied but never admitted. He was more patient, liked to think before acting, and this often balanced out Frank's impulsiveness. At that moment, they were talking about the upcoming football game. The hum of the squad car's engine was soft, almost like background noise, as Frank, with his arm resting on the open window, spoke enthusiastically. "The Patriots are going to crush it on Sunday, Mike. It's going to be a blowout," Frank said confidently, lightly tapping the steering wheel. Mike smiled, used to Frank's exaggerated optimism about his team. "You say that every week, Frank. Sooner or later, they're going to disappoint you." Frank laughed, and for a moment, the weight of the job seemed far away. But it didn't last long. As they crossed the main avenue, Frank suddenly slowed down, his eyes fixed on something ahead. He squinted, focusing on a young black man who had just exited a convenience store, carrying a package under his arm, walking toward a sleek black sedan parked under the shade of a tree. "Did you see that?" Frank said, not taking his eyes off the man. Mike glanced over but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. "See what?" "That guy. Let's check him out," Frank replied, already steering the car toward the sidewalk. He didn't wait for a response. "Frank, the guy's just going to his car. What did he do wrong?" Mike tried to intervene, but Frank was already opening the door of the squad car. He looked at Mike with an expression that said he had done this kind of stop before. "It was just another one." "You never know," Frank muttered, stepping out with firm, determined steps. The young man, who was about to open his car door, turned around when he heard Frank's voice. He saw the officer walking toward him with a stiff posture, hand on his belt, and his eyes widened for a second. But he didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he tried to stay calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" the young man asked, his voice calm but with a hint of apprehension. He was still holding the package, which now felt heavy in his hands. "ID," Frank said bluntly, not even answering the man's question. "What are you doing around here?" The young man blinked, surprised. "I'm heading home. I work at the precinct. I'm a cop too. I have my badge in the car." Frank didn't hesitate. "A cop, huh? All right, where's the badge then?" Before the young man could respond, Frank was already shoving him against the car with force. The package fell to the ground, making a muffled sound as it hit the asphalt. Frank frisked him without ceremony, pressing him against the sedan. "If you're a cop, where's the badge?" he repeated with disdain, as if the young man were telling an obvious lie. "It's in the glove compartment," the young man replied, his voice trembling with indignation but still trying to keep his composure. "Please, look. I'm telling the truth." Mike, who had been watching the scene closely, took a step forward, uncomfortable with how Frank was handling the situation. "Frank, hold on," he said, his voice firmer now. "He said he's a cop. Let's check it out before we do anything else." Frank sighed, not loosening his grip on the young man. "Search the car, Mike." Reluctantly, Mike walked over to the sedan. He opened the driver's side door and searched the glove compartment. There, among some papers, he found the badge, legitimate and shining. Holding it in his hand for a moment, Mike felt a weight settle in his chest before raising his gaze to Frank. "Frank, he's one of us," Mike said, holding up the badge for Frank to see. For a brief moment, Frank's face froze. The discomfort began to spread, as if reality was finally sinking in. He slowly released the young man, his heart pounding faster than he would admit. The feeling of having made a mistake crept in like a growing shadow. "Sorry," Frank said, but the words sounded dry, almost lifeless. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted mistakes easily. It must have been a misunderstanding. The young man adjusted his clothes, clearly indignant. His eyes locked on Frank's for a long second, heavy with a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "Too common a misunderstanding," he muttered, not taking his eyes off Frank. He took the badge from Mike's hand, offered a brief thanks, got into the sedan, and drove away without looking back. The sound of the engine fading into the distance left an awkward silence between the two partners. Frank stood there, watching the car disappear, his lips pressed into a tight line. He felt the weight of his mistake but pushed it to the back of his mind. "Let's go," he said, getting back into the squad car, trying to act as if nothing had happened. Mike remained silent for a moment, but the discomfort on his face was clear. He had known Frank long enough to recognize that something inside him was stirred, even if he would never admit it. As he started the engine, Mike wondered if this misunderstanding had left a deeper mark on both of them than Frank was willing to accept. The sound of the precinct doors closing was the familiar noise that marked the end of another shift. Frank and Mike walked into the precinct's break room, where some of the other officers were already relaxing after a long day. The atmosphere there was always a mix of laughter, jokes, and light conversation. It was the kind of place where stories were exaggerated, small incidents became major events, and where everyone tried to disconnect from the problems of the streets. Frank, however, was visibly tense. Mike could see it. The incident with the young officer was still fresh in his mind, but Frank wasn't the type to admit when something bothered him. Instead, he kept moving forward, as if nothing had happened. "So, how was the patrol?" asked Tom, one of their colleagues, setting down the newspaper he had been reading. Frank shrugged, dropping into a chair. "Nothing much. Had to straighten out a rookie today." Mike, who was pouring himself a cup of coffee, paused for a moment. He knew Frank was downplaying the situation. The discomfort in Mike's expression didn't go unnoticed, but he let Frank continue. "Oh yeah? What happened?" Tom asked, intrigued. Frank let out a short laugh, forcing a lightness in his voice. "Ah, you know how it is. The guy walks out of a store looking suspicious, looks like he's up to no good, and it turns out he's just a rookie with a badge in the glove compartment." Tom laughed along, shaking his head. "These rookies always think they can walk around unnoticed. I bet he had a great expression when you pinned him." Frank shook his head, as if it were something trivial. He was pissed, of course. But who cares, right? He's got to learn he can't walk around thinking no one will question him. Mike, silent, leaned against the wall with his cup of coffee in hand. He watched Frank closely. He knew his partner was distorting the story, but he wasn't the kind to provoke unnecessary confrontations, especially in public. The sergeant entered the room shortly after, interrupting the conversation. "Carter, Benson, good work today. No major trouble, right?" "No, sir," Frank quickly replied. "All good." The sergeant nodded and walked away, and the conversation returned to trivial matters. As their colleagues talked about their patrols and past stories, Mike noticed Frank was quieter than usual. He was drinking his coffee in large gulps, as if trying to focus on something else. The discomfort was visible. "Well, that's it," Frank said finally, standing up and grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. "I'm heading home. See you all tomorrow." Mike followed him out, and as soon as they were alone in the hallway, he decided to speak. "You know you didn't have to treat the guy like that, right?" Frank stopped, his jaw clenched. He avoided looking directly at Mike. "I did what I thought had to be done. He's a cop, Frank. One of our own," Mike said softly but firmly. "You could have given him a chance to explain." Frank finally looked at Mike, his expression hardened. "I was doing my job. I can't afford to let my guard down." Mike shook his head. "And now? Are you going to keep pretending nothing happened?" Frank was silent for a moment before letting out a frustrated sigh. "It's nothing. Let it go." When Frank got home, the sky was already tinged with dark blue, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. He opened the front door and was greeted by the familiar smell of home-cooked food. Jessica, his wife, was in the kitchen finishing up dinner, while his daughter Emily was sitting on the couch, focused on her homework. "Hi, Dad," Emily said cheerfully, glancing up for a moment. "Hi, sweetie," Frank replied, his voice softer than at work but still carrying tension. He approached Jessica and kissed her on the cheek. "How's your day?" she asked, stirring a pot on the stove. "Uneventful," Frank lied, collapsing onto the couch with a heavy sigh. He wanted to disconnect, to forget the nagging feeling that had followed him since the incident earlier. "Anything interesting on patrol?" Jessica pressed, not noticing the discomfort on her husband's face. "Ah, just a misunderstanding with a rookie," Frank said, trying to keep the tone light. "Had to teach him a thing or two about how to handle himself on the street." Jessica paused for a moment, looking over her shoulder. "Teach or intimidate?" Frank felt a slight tightness in his chest. Jessica's tone, though casual, carried a dose of criticism. "He was asking for it, Jess. He was acting strange." "Maybe he was just going home," she replied, turning back to the pot. "Not everyone you see on the street is a criminal, Frank." He remained silent, the discomfort growing. Jessica rarely confronted him about work, but in recent months, he felt she had become increasingly observant. It made him uncomfortable, but he didn't know how to react. He quickly changed the subject. "What's for dinner?" he asked, getting up from the couch and heading to the table. Jessica didn't press the issue. She knew when to let things go. Later, when Emily was already in bed, Frank and Jessica sat together on the couch to watch TV. But Frank's mind was far from the screen. He couldn't shake the image of the young officer, his angry and tired expression, as if he were used to being treated that way. He stayed silent, but the feeling persisted. Something inside him was beginning to crack, even though he still didn't want to admit it. The next morning seemed like any other as Frank walked into the precinct. He moved with his usual firm steps, his face expressionless as usual. Mike, always more laid back, was already sipping his coffee and flipping through a random magazine in the lobby. The precinct was in its usual rhythm, constant phone calls, paperwork piled on desks, and the low hum of officers chatting, each preparing for the day's shift. Frank still felt a slight tension that had been bothering him since the day before, but he tried to ignore it. As always, he pushed the feeling to the back of his mind, focusing on another day of work. He walked over to Mike's desk and gave him a light pat on the shoulder. "Ready for another day at war?" Frank joked, with a forced smile. "Ready," Mike replied with a tired smile, handing Frank a cup of coffee. "But I heard today's going to be more interesting." Before Frank could ask what Mike meant, the sergeant walked into the common room, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "Listen up, folks. Meeting in 5 minutes in the conference room. We have important news." Frank and Mike exchanged curious glances and followed the flow of officers heading to the meeting room. Once everyone was seated, the sergeant stood at the front, with an unusual look of pride on his face. "Today is a special day. We're welcoming a new captain to lead our unit. He's young, but he already has an impressive track record. Captain James Matthews comes highly recommended and has done an amazing job in several divisions. He's going to be a great asset to us." Frank, who had been listening to the introduction with some distraction, felt something strange when he heard the name. James Matthews. For a moment, the sound of the name echoed in his mind, accompanied by an unsettling feeling. He didn't know why, but he started to feel a tightening in his chest. "Please, welcome our new captain." The door to the conference room opened, and when Frank looked up, shock overtook his face. It was him. The young black man he had humiliated the night before in the parking lot. James walked in with a firm and calm posture, his eyes quickly scanning the room before briefly landing on Frank. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Frank felt his blood turn cold. James, however, maintained impeccable composure. He showed no sign of resentment. If the incident from the night before was still fresh in his mind, he didn't show it. He stood at the front of the room next to the sergeant and began to speak in a controlled, confident voice. "Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I know replacing such an experienced captain as the previous one isn't an easy task, but I hope to contribute with my experience and bring new approaches to our team." His gaze swept the room again, stopping briefly on Frank before continuing. "I value teamwork and efficiency, and I believe we can learn a lot from each other." As James spoke, Frank felt a mix of embarrassment and dread. How had this happened? He wanted to move, wanted to look away, but he was frozen. It felt like every word James spoke was directed at him, even though the young captain didn't mention the incident from the previous night. The air in the room seemed heavier, and the weight of the mistake he had made was beginning to feel unbearable. Mike noticed the tension on Frank's face and gave him a gentle nudge, trying to break the mood. "You okay?" he whispered. Yeah, Frank muttered, unsure of how to respond. But he clearly wasn't okay. James finished his brief introduction with a few words of encouragement. "I'm here to help. I know I can learn a lot from all of you, and I hope we can do great work together." With that, he nodded and stepped away, leaving the room for the officers to return to their duties. As soon as the meeting ended, the chatter began. Frank overheard bits of conversation, where some colleagues commented on how young James was to be a captain, but that he had an impeccable reputation. Most were impressed with his resume and the confident way he had presented himself. Frank, however, couldn't stop thinking about the look James had given him, even if only for a brief moment. The young captain hadn't mentioned what had happened the night before, but the silence was even more deafening. Why hadn't he said anything? Frank wondered. He had expected a reprimand, a sharp comment, some form of passive revenge. But nothing. James seemed above it all. It left him unsettled. As they returned to their desks, Frank muttered to Mike, "Can you believe it? The guy from last night is our new captain." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, Frank. This is going to be interesting." Frank didn't respond. Something inside him was stirring, a growing discomfort, and he knew that a confrontation between him and James was inevitable. How was he supposed to act now? Ignoring the incident seemed impossible, but he didn't know how to handle the situation. The idea of facing the young man who was now his superior was, to say the least, unsettling. The rest of the day dragged on in silence for Frank. He could barely focus on his tasks. The image of James, firm and unshakable, stayed in his mind. At the end of the shift, he left early, telling Mike he needed some time to think. But he knew the real challenge would come when he faced the captain head-on. The end of the shift came, but for Frank, the tension only grew. He knew that at some point, the new captain, James Matthews, would call him in for a conversation. It was inevitable, and it bothered him deeply. Since the meeting, Frank felt as if every move he made was being watched. Not by James, who seemed to treat the incident with the same professional distance he treated any other issue, but by himself. It was as if the weight of the mistake was multiplying inside him as the young captain maintained an immaculate posture. The next morning, what Frank had been dreading happened. He had barely arrived at the precinct when the phone on his desk rang. He answered without thinking, but when he heard the sergeant's voice on the other end, his stomach sank. "Captain Matthews wants to see you in his office, Carter." "Now." "Understood," Frank replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Hanging up the phone, he looked at Mike, who was watching the situation cautiously. "The time has come, huh?" Mike commented with a forced smile. "Don't worry, Frank. If he wanted to screw you over, he would have done it by now." Frank just nodded, but the calm Mike was trying to convey didn't reach him. He knew something was coming, and it wouldn't be easy. With a heavy heart, Frank stood up and walked to the captain's office. The office door was slightly ajar, and Frank hesitated before knocking. He knew this conversation would change the course of things. He took a deep breath, clenched his fist, and knocked twice on the door. "Come in," said James' calm voice from the other side. Frank pushed the door open carefully and entered. James' office was simple but elegant. The desk was organized, with folders stacked neatly and a pen carefully positioned next to a notepad. James sat behind the desk, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intense. He gestured lightly with his head, indicating for Frank to sit in the chair in front of him. "Captain," Frank began, trying to sound formal and respectful, though his words came out more tense than he would have liked. James observed him for a moment, then crossed his fingers over the desk. Silence hung in the air for a few seconds, and Frank could almost hear his own heart pounding. "Detective Carter," James began, finally breaking the silence, "thank you for coming." Frank nodded, unsure of what to say. The discomfort in his body grew. I imagine you want to talk about what happened in the parking lot." James raised an eyebrow but didn't seem angry. "Indeed. I thought it would be important to clear some things up." Frank felt a lump in his throat. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he didn't know how to start. He awkwardly tried to justify himself. "Captain, I acted impulsively. I was doing my job and I made a mistake. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I just thought that, well, I thought you might be." He didn't finish the sentence. The words sounded wrong, even in his own head. James kept his gaze fixed on Frank, but his expression wasn't judgmental. He sighed lightly before speaking. "I understand, Carter. I know that in your line of work, suspicion is part of the job. I don't expect you to treat everyone you encounter as innocent. But what happened in that parking lot goes beyond a simple misunderstanding." Frank swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words. I'm sorry for what happened. It was a mistake." James leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, but his tone still calm. "I accept your apology, Carter. But there's something more important here. I'm not just concerned with what happened to me. Situations like that, where a man is judged before he's heard, are far too common. That's the real problem." Frank felt the weight of the words. They pierced through his armor of justifications. He knew the captain was right, but admitting it was difficult. It was as if an internal struggle was taking place within him. On one side, his pride as a veteran cop who believed he knew how to do his job. On the other, the uncomfortable reality that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong in his assumptions. James, noticing Frank's discomfort, let the silence linger for another moment before softening his tone. "I know this isn't easy, Carter. But I'm not here to punish or humiliate you. I'm here to lead, and part of being a good leader is ensuring we all learn from our mistakes. Including myself." Frank finally took a deep breath and, for the first time since entering the office, allowed his words to come out uncalculated. "Captain, I know I messed up. I don't know if I can change overnight, but I'll try. I'm really sorry." James nodded, satisfied with Frank's honesty, even if it was restrained. "That's all we need, Carter. The effort to try to do better. I hope we can work together productively. Let's not let what happened define our relationship going forward." Frank finally relaxed, feeling the weight of the confrontation lifted. He still had a lot to think about, but for the first time in a long time, he felt willing to face these issues. He stood up, and James did the same, extending his hand. Frank shook the captain's hand, firm but with genuine respect. "Thank you, Captain. It won't happen again." James smiled slightly. "I hope not, Carter." Frank left the office feeling strangely lighter, but also with a new responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He knew this conversation was just the beginning of something bigger. The change started here, and he was about to embark on a path he never expected to take. Frank had felt different since the conversation with Captain James. Something resonated within him, like an old wound that was beginning to heal. He still didn't know exactly how to act, but the idea that he needed to change his perceptions and attitudes was now deeply rooted. However, change was never easy, and he knew he would need to prove to himself that he was capable of improving. That morning, he and Mike were back on patrol, driving through the streets of Ashtonville as they had done hundreds of times before. The sky was overcast, and a light breeze swept the leaves across the asphalt. Traffic was slow, and Frank drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road. He was still thinking about the conversation with James, the captain's words echoing in his mind. Some of our perceptions need to change. He knew James was right, but change wasn't automatic, and Frank felt the weight of this new responsibility. Mike noticed his partner's unusual silence and decided to break it. "You seem quiet today, Frank. Everything okay?" Frank shrugged, not taking his eyes off the road. "Just thinking." "About the captain?" Mike asked, already knowing the answer. Frank nodded, still looking straight ahead. "He's right, you know. I acted like an idiot. And it made me realize that maybe I've done this kind of thing before, without even noticing." Mike, who usually avoided deep discussions during work, sensed that Frank was genuinely trying to open up. He knew his partner was struggling with something internal. "Look, Frank. The important thing is that you've realized it now. Most guys don't even admit they need to change. That's already a big step." Frank let out a heavy sigh, but before he could respond, the radio in the squad car crackled. The operator's voice came through, clear and urgent. "All units, we have reports of a suspicious young man, wearing a black jacket, seen loitering near an electronics store on 5th Avenue. Suspect matches the description of someone involved in a recent robbery in the area. Proceed with caution." Frank and Mike exchanged quick glances. Both of their police instincts were immediately activated. "It's our area," Frank said, accelerating the car and turning on the sirens. "Let's check it out." The streets of Ashtonville blurred past as the squad car sped through. Within minutes, they arrived at 5th Avenue. Parking the car, they turned off the sirens and began patrolling the area on foot. Frank's heart was pounding. He knew the moment to put what he had learned to the test was approaching. They spotted the young man standing near the entrance of the store, seemingly distracted. He was wearing a black jacket, exactly as described, and was nervously glancing around. Frank felt the old tension run through his body, the same instinct that always led him to act before thinking. What if this was the robbery suspect? What if he was armed? Frank looked at Mike, who seemed ready for the approach. This time, however, Frank took a deep breath before acting. Instead of going straight for an aggressive approach, as he would have done in the past, he decided to try something different. He walked toward the young man with firm steps, but without the usual harshness. "Hey, kid," Frank said, his voice softer than usual but still firm. The young man looked at him, eyes wide, clearly nervous. "I didn't do anything," the young man said immediately, raising his hands as if already preparing for the worst. Frank felt a pang of familiarity. The fear in the boy's eyes reminded him of the scene with James, and it paralyzed him for a brief moment. In his mind, he once again heard James' words, "Why did you act that way with me before even hearing me out?" Frank looked at the young man, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't just see a suspect. He saw a person. Someone who was scared, someone who was about to be judged without even having a chance to explain. "It's okay," Frank said, his tone calmer now. "We just want to talk." The young man seemed confused, as if he wasn't used to this kind of approach. He slowly lowered his hands, but his eyes were still alert. "What's your name?" Mike asked cautiously. "Chris," the young man replied, swallowing hard. "Chris," Frank repeated, trying to keep his tone calm. "We're here because someone reported a guy in a black jacket loitering around this area, and we thought it might be you. But we want to hear your side. What are you doing here?" Chris blinked, surprised. For a moment, he seemed unable to believe that he was being listened to. I was just waiting for my cousin. He works at this electronics store. I didn't do anything wrong." Frank looked at Mike, who gave a small nod of confirmation. Both of them knew there was something sincere in Chris' tone. But before they could ask any more questions, the door to the electronics store opened, and a young man wearing the store's uniform stepped out. "Chris, you're here." The young man, clearly Chris' cousin, looked at the officers and explained himself. "Sorry, he was just waiting for me. I had to close the store, and he came earlier." Frank felt an immediate sense of relief. The kid had nothing to do with the crime they were investigating. It was just a misunderstanding. He let out the breath he had been holding, and for the first time, he was glad he hadn't acted impulsively. "Sorry for the misunderstanding, Chris," Frank said, looking directly at the young man. "We didn't mean to scare you." Chris, still surprised by how everything had unfolded, slowly nodded. "It's okay. I'm just not used to being treated like this." Chris' words cut Frank deeper than he expected. There was truth in that statement, and it echoed the same criticism that James had made. Many, like Chris, were used to being seen as suspects before being seen as people. Frank and Mike said their goodbyes and returned to the squad car. On the way back, the silence was more reflective and tense. "Good job back there," Mike said, breaking the silence with an approving tone. "You managed to keep your cool." Frank smiled slightly, but he was still deep in thought. "I think I'm starting to understand what the captain was talking about." The sun was already setting when Frank and Mike received a call over the radio. The urgent tone in the operator's voice made Frank immediately sit up straight in his seat. "All units, we need backup on 14th Street. Report of a gang-related shooting. Civilians are injured, and one young man is in critical condition. Ambulance en route. Proceed with caution." Frank looked at Mike, and they both nodded. They knew this type of situation could easily spiral out of control. In a shooting, things happen fast, and lives were lost just as quickly. Frank turned on the sirens and sped down the road, tension filling the car. This time, however, something was different inside Frank. He felt a clarity he hadn't had before, a need to do the right thing, to act quickly but carefully. The streets blurred past as the car's sirens echoed through the empty avenues. When they arrived on 14th Street, chaos had already taken over. Officers were already on the scene, trying to control the situation, while civilians watched from a distance, some filming with their phones, others shouting for help. Frank got out of the squad car with Mike close behind. A crowd had gathered near a narrow alley, and that's where Frank saw the young man lying on the ground. He couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old. A pool of blood was rapidly spreading around him, and his face was pale, his eyes half open, as if life were slowly slipping away from him. Without thinking twice, Frank ran toward the young man. He knew the protocol was to wait for paramedics, but the boy didn't have much time. When he reached him, he knelt beside him, pressing his hands against the wound on his abdomen, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," Frank said, looking directly at the boy. "The ambulance is on its way. Just stay with me." The young man opened his eyes with effort, his breathing irregular and shallow. Frank could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear he had seen before in Chris, and more recently, in James. But this was a more primal, more desperate fear, the fear of dying. I didn't do anything," the young man murmured with difficulty. "They just showed up and started shooting." Frank nodded, still pressing the wound. "I believe you. Don't worry about that now. We're going to get you out of here." Mike was beside him, crouching and keeping an eye on the area to ensure the situation was secure, while Frank continued trying to keep the young man conscious. The sound of the ambulance's siren could be heard in the distance, but Frank knew time was against them. "How's he doing?" Mike asked, concerned. "Not great," Frank replied, looking at the blood still seeping through his fingers. "But he's going to make it. He has to." Frank's words were almost a plea. For the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine connection to the person in front of him. This wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't about maintaining order or enforcing the law. It was about saving a life, a young life that was hanging by a thread, a life that, in any other situation, he might have judged without knowing. "What's your name?" Frank asked, hoping to keep the young man talking, to keep him from losing consciousness. "Marcus," the young man replied, his voice barely escaping his lips. "You're going to be okay, Marcus," Frank said, trying to hide his own anxiety. "The ambulance is almost here. Just keep breathing, all right?" The young man tried to nod but was visibly weakening. Frank looked around, the panic in his chest rising, but he fought it. He needed to stay calm, needed to be strong for this kid. Finally, the ambulance turned the corner, and paramedics rushed toward them with a stretcher. Frank stepped back slightly, allowing the professionals to take over, but his eyes never left Marcus. As the paramedics stabilized the young man and loaded him onto the stretcher, Frank took a step back, watching Marcus' pale face as it was covered by an oxygen mask. There was a strange silence inside Frank, as if he were suspended in time. A part of him knew that not too long ago, he might have ignored what the young man was saying, might have looked at him with suspicion, might have treated Marcus as just another case in a long list. But in that moment, Marcus was everything. He was a kid, injured, scared, and Frank cared. The paramedics loaded Marcus into the ambulance and shut the doors, speeding away toward the hospital. Frank stood still for a moment, his hands still stained with blood, breathing deeply. Mike approached, placing a reassuring hand on Frank's shoulder. "You did what you could, Frank." Frank nodded slowly, still absorbing what had happened. I had to do it," he said, not knowing exactly who he was speaking to, perhaps to Mike, perhaps to himself. Later that night, Frank returned home, physically and emotionally exhausted. Jessica was waiting for him, her eyes filled with concern when she saw him walk in, his face tired and his hands trembling. "Are you okay?" she asked gently as he dropped his keys on the counter inside. "I had a tough day," Frank replied, sitting down at the kitchen table. Jessica approached, placing a cup of tea in front of him. She knew it wasn't easy for Frank to talk about work, but she also knew he needed to vent. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Frank looked at the tea, then at his hands, still imagining Marcus' blood on them. I saved a kid today. But he almost died. I think a few months ago, I wouldn't have acted the same way." Jessica sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "You're changing, Frank. And that's a good thing." He took a deep breath, Jessica's words bringing an unexpected lightness to his heart. "I hope so," he murmured, still staring into the distance. "I really hope so." A few months had passed since the incident with Marcus, and Frank Carter's life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. The emotional scars from the situations he had faced were still there, but instead of ignoring them as he had done so many times before, he now confronted them head-on. He had learned that true strength lay in recognizing his mistakes and wanting to transform. At the precinct, things had changed as well. Under Captain James Matthews' leadership, the department's atmosphere was more collaborative and less rigid. James had managed, with his calm yet firm approach, to implement small but important changes in how officers conducted their interactions. Frank, who had once resisted any idea of change, now found himself more open. His interactions with his colleagues had improved, and he made an effort to treat each person with more humanity and less suspicion. It was a spring morning when Frank and James met again in the captain's office. This time, there was no tension, just a light conversation as they reviewed some patrol reports. The relationship between the two, which had started with a bitter misunderstanding, was now marked by mutual respect. "You're really changing things around here, Captain," Frank said with a sincere smile as he flipped through one of the reports. "I wouldn't have believed it a few months ago, but it's true. The department is different." James looked at Frank and gave a small smile. "Change is hard, Carter. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's the small decisions we make every day that really make the difference." Frank nodded, his words carrying a weight he now deeply understood. "I know. It took me a while to realize that, but I think I'm finally getting it." James closed the file on his desk and crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "You've done good work, Frank. Not everyone has the courage to recognize what needs to change within themselves. I see that in you." Frank was silent for a moment, pondering James' words. He knew the captain was right. Looking back, he remembered the person he had been in the parking lot, acting on instinct and prejudice, judging before listening. The change in his life had not only been at work, it had also impacted how he interacted with his family and with himself. "I owe you a lot, James," Frank said sincerely. "If you hadn't challenged me, if you hadn't handled what happened the way you did, I never would have changed. I always thought being a cop was just about following protocol, keeping order. But now I see it's so much more than that." James looked at Frank with respect and empathy. "We're all learning, Frank. Every day. The important thing is that we're willing to keep trying." Frank smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. "I think I'm ready now." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the phone in James' office, but before answering, he looked at Frank with one last piece of advice, gentle but loaded with wisdom: "The important thing is to never stop learning, Carter. Change never ends." Frank stood up from the chair, shook James' hand firmly, and left the office with a new feeling. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew he was ready to face his own demons, ready to continue his journey of redemption. As he walked through the precinct's corridors, passing colleagues and the new recruits now arriving at the department, Frank knew his role there had changed. He was no longer the same man he had been months ago. Captain James Matthews, the young man he had so quickly judged, had become the mentor he never expected to have. And while there was still a long road ahead, Frank was at peace with the fact that he was changing, and that this time, it was for the better. The transformation was slow, full of challenges, but it was real. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.